Hi, Chris. So we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you're a professor at NYU Law School.
Yes.
And you've been writing about copyright and incentives and empirical research into this very important topic. So
right. So over the years, I've done a bunch of research projects, which can be kind of categorized into two different branches. One is I've been looking at creative industries that don't rely so heavily on copyright and trying to figure out what their innovation incentives are, whether there are other factors that sustain their innovation incentives other than copyright. And then the second type of project is a more controlled laboratory experiment where co-authors and I have been looking at a variety of different questions about how copyright and indeed patent incentivize creativity and whether those incentives can be shown to be operating in the context of a lab experiment.
Yeah, and now you've kind of been bringing these together and wrote this useful survey article, which we're here to discuss today.
Yeah, so it's funny. So I'm giving two talks while I'm in Zurich. One is one I gave yesterday on this general question of what do we know about copyright incentives and what don't we know. The second is a particular project. It's a privacy project, so that's the talk I'll give today, and that's a mixed lab field experiment that looks at how people make decisions whether or not to disclose private information. So that totally different subject.
Okay. Yeah.
The first talk I was interested in giving, I gave it a year or two ago for the first time in a bid to just try to pull together some work that's been done and to make the point that we've learned some things, but there's still a lot of blank space to be filled in, and there's another generation or two of work that needs to be done before we can declare ourselves satisfied in any way.
Yeah, so maybe if we could just kind of take a step back and maybe for viewers that don't know much about copyright, why do you think there is this blank space? Kind of, why is there so much still to learn?
Sure. So to go all the way back, so the narrative of copyright is very sensible. So here's the narrative. We want artists and writers to produce more new artistic and literary works. And so we want to encourage them to do so. How do we encourage them? We give them property rights, that is copyright in their work. That prevents, or at least in an ideal world, would prevent others from copying the work that they do. So when they invest in new creative works, they or their business partners, publishers, movie studios, etc., will reap the rewards and not some copyist, some pirate. So that's the theory, and I mean the theory just makes such good intuitive sense that it might be it might seem a little bit kind of like a waste of time to actually do the work needed to show in the real world or in the lab that theory actually works the way it's supposed to work. But there's examples in life where you think something works a certain way and it seems very sensible that it would work that way, and when you look at it empirically, it doesn't. So,
and we know, I mean, you call these studies in your survey, you call them negative space studies. So these are studies where we know creativity happens, creative output is being shared, but there is, for whatever reason, no copyright. So, for example, fashion, tattoos.
Yeah, so the U.S. fashion industry is a good example. So there's a lot of creative work that goes into creating a season's new designs across the fashion industry. There are lots of companies, there's lots of money invested, there's lots of new clothes every season. In the US, at least, very, very little of this output has been protected at all by copyright. In the US, useful articles are broadly not protected by copyright, and clothing is thought to be historically a useful article. So it keeps you warm, it covers your body. That's a little bit odd. I mean, why spend so much money on clothing? It's not because it keeps you warm necessarily.
It's covering ourselves.
Right. It's expressing something, but that's not the way the law has really treated it. So we get this kind of open space where copyright doesn't really protect these things. And you might think, if you followed the theory through to its conclusion, that we'd have underinvestment in the U.S. in the production of new clothing designs, especially maybe relative to Europe, which has very encompassing copyright protection for designs. But if you look at the world, that's actually not true. The U.S. fashion industry is very vibrant. It's very creative. It's growing quite rapidly. It's not losing out, as far as we can see, to its European counterparts. So, what explains that? And that's some early work that I did with Cal Rostiala, my friend and co-author. And our explanation goes all the way back to Shakespeare, who said it's the fashion that wears out more apparel than the man. So that's from Much Ado About Nothing. And what he's saying there is, at least affluent people, they don't get rid of their clothes because they wear out. It's not the man that wears out the clothes, it's the fashion. So the fashion changes and people discard clothes because the fashion's changing. So take that quote from Shakespeare and kind of project it forward in time. This process of fashion change depends to a certain extent on copying. So a fashion design comes out, it's new, people see it on runway shows, they think, oh, that's attractive. Other producers start to copy it or start to be inspired by it and produce similar clothes. It spreads.
People wear it more and more.
Becomes a trend.
Yeah.
Becomes a trend. People recognize a trend. Trends are very attractive to people because people want to be in fashion, right?
But then it's not exclusively on the runway anymore, so people, so then the runway looks for something else.
Well, yeah, so copying keeps building, and at a certain point it becomes overdone, and there are people among us who are very concerned with their clothes being right at the cutting edge, and so these people stop wearing the trend starts to collapse. At the time the trend starts to collapse, a new trend is expanding because copying has moved on to some new design. So this is the trend cycle. I mean, this is not surprising. What's I think a bit surprising is that it's copying that actually drives this forward. Without copying, things would go slower. There'd be less change. There'd be less innovation. So there's an example where the theory, which is pretty simple, doesn't actually address the reality, which is a little bit more subtle and complex.
No, that's great. And I mean, if anyone wants to read more about kind of copyright and fashion, Chris has actually written quite some things about that, and you can find that on his website at NYU Law School. But let me just go back to one other thing you said. So you pointed out that kind of in this space we have the US versus the European area, and there are other studies that use this kind of natural variation in different copyright laws. So you call these event studies, and you discuss about them a bit.
Sure.
But interestingly, these go back way back, to Napoleonic times.
Right. So this is a study by two economists, Gioselli and Moser, that looks at opera production during the Napoleonic occupation of northern Italy. I think this is an excellent study. Petra Moser is also at NYU. She's at the business school. Her work is terrific, and this is a good example of the quality of the work she does. So what Gioselli and Moser do is they look at two northern Italian states, Venetia and Lombardy, that adopted copyright laws soon after the Napoleonic occupation. So the copyright laws there were no copyright laws before the Napoleonic occupation, and then they adopted them, and the terms were pretty short. It was the life of the author plus 10 years. So given lifespans at that time, probably about like 45 years maybe on average. So, okay.
Bad for the Italians, good for us.
Yeah, so exactly. So this is a nice opportunity to study whether there was more opera production in these states that adopted copyright law compared to the states in northern Italy that are otherwise reasonably similar, but that didn't adopt copyright law at this point. And what Gioselli and Moser find is, again, kind of complex. So in the states that adopted copyright, Venetia and Lombardy, there was production of more operas after copyright was adopted. There was production of more durably popular operas after copyright was adopted. And that sounds great. That sounds like, well, at least in this time and place for this type of creativity, this is working out the way the theory would suggest. They then look at another change, which is these two states increased the term of copyright by another 10 years. And they ask, well, did that actually further increase the production of operas? And the answer is, didn't seem to. Right? So what do they conclude? They conclude that a little bit of copyright, at least for this form of production, might be very useful, but more copyright doesn't necessarily seem to be useful at all, which is a nice question to address, because often we're not talking about some or none. We're talking about some or more copyright, and that's the question that they should.
And current copyright terms are a lot longer.
Copyright terms are a lot longer today, so their paper would cause you to ask some questions about what the optimal length is. But I would add that opera is a particular form of cultural production. It's a very high cost, very high fixed cost form of cultural production. And there are some significant forms of culture that are like that, so blockbuster movies are like that. But there's a lot of cultural production that's not like that. So popular music, a lot of popular music is relatively cheap to produce. So you can ask some questions whether, copyright would have the same effect on low fixed cost forms of creativity as it would on high fixed cost forms of creativity like opera. Great question. We don't know a lot about that yet, but this is this is
so let's keep in mind this might just be, it might be linked to certain types of industries, it might be linked to certain types of creativity or expression.
Right, but it gives us, the study gives us some encouragement that under the right circumstances, copyright can do a lot of good. It's just like how narrow are those circumstances and what's the limit to that. So that still remains to be seen.
So just to narrow it even further, there's a third type of studies which you've done quite extensively as well and are still doing, which are experimental studies. So then you go into the lab and you really narrow down on what motivates creativity, what pushes people to produce creative solutions, what kind of institutional changes. So can you just
so working along with Jeannie Fromer and Chris Buckafusco and Zachary Burns, I'll just talk about one study that involved the question of the structure of creative incentives. So you observe, if you look at copyright and then you look at patent, that the creative incentives that those two types of legal protection create are actually kind of different. So copyright, you can get a copyright with a relatively modest amount of creative work. If you produce a copyrightable piece of subject matter that isn't merely copied from somebody else, and it contains some modest spark of creativity, that's enough to get you a copyright. Patent's a lot more difficult. So the patent, in order to be granted, has to be novel and non-obvious, right, and useful. Those are all requirements that are quite a bit more robust, much more creativity required to get a patent in general than a copyright. So we thought, well, why don't we invent a creativity game and then have people play this creativity game? In a control condition, we'll just pay them a fixed fee for playing the creativity game. And then we'll have a copyright condition where if they come up with a creative solution, even a very modest creative solution, they become eligible to win a prize, a cash prize. And their eligibility, how likely they are to win the prize depends on how good their solution is. So if their solution is really good, it's really creative, we give them more lottery tickets. So if their solution is less creative, we give them fewer. But they just have to be very slightly creative to get in the game. Right? So that's,
if my book's better, then I'll sell it more.
If your book's better, it's likely to sell more, or more likely to get a publishing contract. But to get a copyright on your book just has to be very modestly creative. Okay, so that's what we're simulating there. So then we have a patent condition, actually more than one, but I'll just generalize. We have the patent condition where, in order to get in the game at all, you have to score pretty well on the creativity game. So you have to do well enough that you get over a threshold, and then once you get over that threshold, again, your chance of winning depends on how creative your solution is relative to other people. Now, we had different forms of creativity games. Let me just give you one. We had a game that involves a kind of mathematical knapsack problem, but we dressed it up in the guise of the old Oregon Trail video game. So we have a covered wagon. You're going to go across the country, and you need to load up the covered wagon with stuff like bacon and ammunition and coffee, stuff that you're going to need for the trip. Each item has a certain value, and each item has a certain weight. The wagon can only hold so much weight, so the challenge is to load up the wagon with as much value as you can carry without going overweight. So the way this problem is constructed, it's extremely hard. So unless you're some great mathematical genius, you're not going to be able to solve it in the time we give you. So you have to actually come up with a creative algorithm that allows you to approximate the solution without actually calculating it. And this is the creativity that we're testing. And we're seeing whether the creativity varies.
Kind of combination of inputs and
Exactly. A combination of inputs within constraints. That's the knapsack problem. This is a very hard problem. So we're looking to see whether people were just paying a flat fee perform differently than people who were giving this kind of copyright incentive to. So if their solution is at least modestly creative, they have the chance to win a prize, and the chance varies depending on how creative. Versus the patent condition where you really have to score pretty well to get in the game. But once you get in the game, again, your chance varies with the creativity of your solution. So here's what we find. The copyright incentive produces no difference versus a control. So if we just pay people a flat fee, it's basically the same as if we give people this kind of copyright incentive. So no real demonstration of an incentive effect at all. On the other hand, the patent incentive produces significantly higher performance. So if you tell people you've got to score really high to get in the game, but once you get in the game, you've got a chance of winning. That depends on quality. People seem to aim higher and do better. is motivating.
Okay. Yeah.
So this suggests, I mean, again, this is just one experiment, and
Uh-huh.
experiments are tricky, and
Mhm.
part of the trickiness is generalizing them to actual life.
Mhm.
But this experiment suggests at least that the structure of how we give incentives can matter, that all incentives are not the same,
Mhm.
and that you have to make deliberate decisions about how you structure them to
Yeah.
get the most out of them.
So the institutional details of how we give incentives are important.
The institutional
Yeah.
details and the fine details of how we craft the legal standards are important.
That is great. So maybe just to kind of try and wrap this up, so we've heard about these very interesting studies, and from all of them we can learn something, but as you said, there's a lot still to be learned.
Yes.
A lot for young researchers, by the way. A lot of space open. But what can we know already? What should policymakers already be thinking about in your view? Or is there anything?
Yeah, so I think there is. So the simple story about creative incentives is just too simple. And this is not surprising. I mean, the world is just incredibly complicated. And the minute you start looking at anything in human life, it seems more complicated.
And then
than it
when you
seems
start
in theory.
focusing in on it, it becomes more complicated and more complicated.
Yeah, so we have a theory. And the theory is
Mhm.
we need to incentivize people to invest in creative works. And the way to incentivize them is to hold out the prospect of rewards. We do that by limiting copying. Okay, so totally sensible theory.
Mhm.
What we've seen so far, and in the paper I go ahead, in the talk, I went through a whole bunch of studies that kind of circle around the same question.
Mhm.
What we see so far is that sometimes that is true in the world, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's true, but it's true only partially and in ways you didn't expect.
Mhm.
So I think what we see in the world is a great deal of variation, that all creativity is not the same.
Mhm.
All creativity is not encouraged in the same way or discouraged in the same way. Some types of creativity are very sensitive to other people pirating. Other types of creativity are not as sensitive to people pirating. It's a complex world that over time we need to learn about by zooming in and looking carefully. And that's actually really great work for people to do.
So at least don't rely too much on kind of the naive story about, well, this is how we incentivize creativity.
Yeah, so I got to say, so here's an analogy. Okay, so it used to be before Galileo that people thought that cannonball would fall faster than a feather.
Yeah.
Why? Because cannonballs were attracted to the earth. They were made of earth elements, and feathers were attracted to the sky because they were made of sky elements. And that gravity affected. Well, people didn't have the idea of gravity, but that different objects fell at different rates.
The attraction of the earth would attract them differently. Yeah.
So that turns out to be wrong, right? But it's a perfectly sensible theoretical construct. Because in the world, we notice that cannonballs do fall really fast and feathers fall pretty slow. That turns out to be completely the effect of air resistance. And if you drop a cannonball in a vacuum and you drop a feather in a vacuum, they both fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? That's kind of the way it works. But until you actually do experiments, you can't know that, right? Because you need to get the conditions right so that you can actually see the world for what it is, and not just some surface phenomenon that, is apparent to you on a casual glance. So that is, I think, at the end of the day, every person who does experiments is aiming to kind of peel back the surface phenomenon and look deeper. And that's just an incredibly satisfying thing to do.
I imagine
when it works.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. And I mean, to end this with a very bad pun let's not fall for the easy theory and kind of the...
So all puns are bad. So don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed. That's actually a pretty good one as it goes.
Yeah. So thanks so much for coming to Zurich. We loved having you here at the Center for Law and Economics. And if you are interested in more of Chris's work, check him out at NYU's website. If you're interested in the center, check us out. And thanks a lot for listening.
Thanks very much.